Washington, D.C., 1951. The Mayflower Hotel. Inside a hushed corner of Harvey's restaurant, the air is thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp tang of gin. Two men sit at a corner table, huddled in a cloud of blue smoke. On one side of the table sits James Jesus Angleton. He is the CIA's chief spy hunter, a man who lives in a wilderness of mirrors, obsessed with rooting out Soviet infiltration. On the other side is his best friend, Kim Philby. Philby is the picture of British elegance, the old-school Thai personified. He has the perfect accent, the perfect pedigree, and a legendary capacity for alcohol. To Angleton, Philby is more than a colleague. He is a mentor, a master professional whom he trusts with the crown jewels of American intelligence. They are halfway through a 3-hour lunch that began with bourbon on the rocks, moved to lobster and wine, and is now finishing with brandy. They laugh. They trade secrets. Angleton believes he is looking at the future head of British intelligence. But behind Philby's warm smile and slight, disarming stutter, there is a cold, calculated betrayal. While he sips his brandy, Philby is mentally cataloging everything Angleton says to report it back to his handlers in Moscow. In the Soviet files, Philby isn't a British diplomat. He is Agent Stanley. He is the man who has already handed Stalin the secrets of the atomic bomb. He is the man who, with a single tip-off, has just sent hundreds of anti-communist commandos to their deaths in the mountains of Albania. Even as they sit here, the net is tightening. Two of Philby's closest associates, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, are preparing to vanish into the night, fleeing for the Soviet border. When the truth finally comes out, it won't just be a scandal. It will be a cataclysm. It will destroy the special relationship between the US and Britain and trigger a wave of paranoia that will paralyze the CIA for a generation. But how does a man like this happen? How does a product of the Western elite decide to burn it all down? To understand the spy of the century, we have to go back to the beginning, to the prestigious halls of Cambridge, where a beautiful mind was first poisoned by a utopian dream. The boy they called Kim wasn't born a traitor. In fact, he was born into the very heart of the British Empire. Harold Adrian Russell Philby entered the world in British India, nicknamed Kim after the orphan spy in Rudyard Kipling's famous novel. It was a name that would prove to be a chilling prophecy. To understand Kim, you have to understand his father, St. John Philby. He was a legendary eccentric, a high-ranking British official who grew so disillusioned with his own country that he converted to Islam and became a personal advisor to the King of Saudi Arabia. He taught young Kim a dangerous lesson: that you could be born into the elite, yet spend your life working to undermine it. Loyalty, the father whispered, was a choice, not a birthright. When Kim arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge in 1929, he found a world in chaos. Outside the ivory towers, the Great Depression was crushing the working class. In Germany, a dark shadow named Hitler was rising. To a generation of brilliant young students, the old systems of democracy and capitalism looked like dying relics. Kim didn't just join the Socialist Society. He looked for a new religion. And he found it in the Red Star of Moscow. For Philby, communism wasn't just a political theory. It was a grand, utopian crusade to save humanity from itself. But a crusade requires a soldier, and a soldier needs a mission. That mission appeared on a sunny afternoon in June 1934 on a quiet park bench in London's Regent's Park. Kim sat down next to a man he knew only as Otto. Otto was a Soviet talent spotter, and he didn't offer Kim money. He offered him something much more addictive, a secret life, a chance to be a hero in a war that no one else could see. Otto told Kim that his upper-class background was his greatest weapon. He told him to cut ties with his radical friends, to stop talking about revolution, and to wear the mask of a loyal British gentleman. He was to penetrate the enemy camp. Kim Philby agreed without hesitation. At 22 years old, he began the most elaborate performance in history. But every spy needs a trial by fire, a place to prove they can lie while under the shadow of death. For Kim, that place was the blood-soaked trenches of the Spanish Civil War. What happened next would convince the world he was a hero, while he was secretly becoming a monster. Spain is tearing itself apart. It's a testing ground for the great ideologies of the 20th century, fascism against communism.
While thousands of young idealists from the West are joining the international brigades to fight for the Republic, Kim Philby arrives with a very different mission. He isn't carrying a rifle. He's carrying a typewriter. To the world, and to his colleagues at the Times of London, Philby is a staunch supporter of General Francisco Franco. He writes glowing reports of the nationalist forces, praising the order and discipline of the fascists. He dines with Italian officers and drinks with German advisors. He plays the role of the right-wing aristocrat so perfectly that even the most paranoid fascist commanders consider him one of us. But beneath the reporter's notebook, the mask is never off. Philby is there under direct orders from Moscow. His job? To provide intelligence on the nationalist high command and, more importantly, to build a legend so deep that no one would ever suspect his true loyalties. Then, fate hands him a miracle. In December 1937, near the frozen ruins of Teruel, a Soviet artillery shell slams into a car carrying Philby and 3 other journalists. It's a scene of absolute carnage. The explosion kills everyone else instantly. Philby is the only survivor, emerging from the wreckage with nothing but a minor gash on his forehead. General Franco himself is so impressed by the brave British reporter that he personally awards Philby the Red Cross of Military Merit. Pause and let that sink in. The future head of British counterintelligence, a committed Soviet mole, is standing at attention while a fascist dictator pins a medal to his chest. To the British establishment back home, this medal was the ultimate character reference. It was a certificate of political purity. It meant that whatever radical nonsense he might have dabbled in at Cambridge was officially forgiven. Philby had his passport. He was no longer just a journalist. He was a hero of the right. And in the shadowy world of intelligence, a hero's welcome is the perfect way to slip through the front door unnoticed. But his biggest prize wasn't a medal. It was an invitation. An invitation to join the most exclusive club in the world, the British Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6. The world is at war. London is trembling under the roar of German bombers. Inside the smoke-filled offices of British intelligence, the mood is one of quiet desperation. They need men, bright, capable men, who can fight the shadow war against Hitler. Kim Philby didn't have to kick the door down. He was invited in. In the 1940s, the British Secret Intelligence Service, known to insiders as the Circus, was the most exclusive club in the world. They didn't use background checks or psychological profiles. They used the old boy network. If you went to the right schools, wore the right tie, and knew the right people, your loyalty was considered a fact of nature. Philby's entry into MI6 was almost absurdly easy.
A recommendation from a family friend, a brief interview over a gin and tonic at a private gentleman's club, and he was in. The officers looking at him saw exactly what they wanted to see. A charming, brilliant aristocrat from a good family. They never bothered to look at his heart. They never looked at the park bench in Regent's Park. Philby was a natural. He worked harder than anyone. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave. He was the life of every party, the man everyone trusted with their secrets because he was so good at pretending he had none of his own. His rise was meteoric. By 1944, Philby was handed the ultimate prize. He was appointed the head of Section 9, the brand new department created specifically to track and catch Soviet spies. Think about the sheer dark brilliance of that move. The man Moscow had spent 10 years training to infiltrate the West was now the man in charge of catching Moscow's agents.
It was the fox being asked to design the security for the chicken coop.
From his desk in London, Philby saw every report, every lead, and every suspicion the British had about Soviet activity. Every time an MI6 officer got close to the truth, Philby was there to nudge them in the wrong direction. He was a master at the gentlemanly art of sabotage. But as the war ended and the Cold War began, Philby was about to be sent to the most important battlefield of all, Washington, D.C. There, he wouldn't just be betraying the British. He would be holding the life of every American operative in his hands. How do you lie to the most suspicious people on Earth for 30 years? You don't do it by telling big, obvious lies. You do it the Philby way. You tell the truth. Philby's greatest weapon was a technique we now call the poisoned truth. He would give the British and the Americans 90% accurate intelligence. Real Soviet troop movements, real diplomatic cables, real names of low-level communist sympathizers. It was brilliant information that built massive trust. But that last 10%? That was the poison. That was where he protected the secrets that actually mattered to Moscow. But in 1945, in the sweltering heat of Istanbul, the mask almost slipped. A Soviet intelligence officer named Konstantin Volkov walked into the British consulate. He had a terrifying offer. He wanted to defect to the West, and in exchange, he would hand over the names of 3 high-ranking Soviet moles working inside the British government. One of them, Volkov whispered, was the head of a counterintelligence department in London. He was talking about Kim Philby. The report was rushed to London. It landed directly on the desk of the only man authorized to handle it, Kim Philby. Imagine that moment.
You open a top-secret file and see your own death warrant written in black and white. Most men would panic. They would flee. Philby didn't even flinch. He lit a cigarette, took a sip of tea, and began to orchestrate a murder. He told his superiors that he needed to fly to Istanbul to personally handle the defector. But then, he used every bureaucratic trick in the book to delay his departure. He claimed there were visa issues. He insisted on more clarification. He dragged his feet for weeks. While the British were busy with paperwork, Philby sent a frantic, coded warning to Moscow. By the time Philby finally arrived in Istanbul, Konstantin Volkov was gone. Witnesses saw a heavily bandaged figure being carried onto a Soviet plane on a stretcher. Volkov was never seen again. He was taken to Moscow, tortured and executed. To MI6, Philby was a hero who had tried his best, but was beaten by unfortunate delays. To Moscow, he was the man who had just saved their most valuable asset.
Philby had learned the most chilling lesson of the Cold War. In the world of shadows, a well-timed accident is better than 1,000 lies. And now, He was headed to the United States to practice that art on a much larger stage. In 1949, Kim Philby arrived in Washington, D.C. as the high-ranking liaison between the British Secret Service and the newly born CIA. To the American intelligence community, he wasn't just another diplomat. He was a rock star. He was the man who had fought the Nazis and knew the Soviets better than anyone. He arrived with the aura of British sophistication that American spies, still finding their feet, deeply admired. It was here that Philby struck up the most dangerous friendship of the Cold War. His partner in crime, though only one of them knew it, was James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's rising star of counterintelligence. Angleton was a man of intense intellect and deepening paranoia.
He saw the world as a wilderness of mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed.
Yet, he made one fatal mistake. He believed that Kim Philby was his mirror image. They were two sides of the same coin, two gentlemen dedicated to protecting the West. They spent their nights drinking at Harvey's restaurant and the Army and Navy Club. Over endless rounds of martinis and steaks, Angleton poured out the CIA's deepest secrets. He told Philby about Venona, the top-secret project to crack Soviet codes. He shared the names of American agents operating behind the Iron Curtain. He discussed the CIA's most ambitious plans to roll back the Soviet Empire. Philby listened with the practiced patience of a predator. He was charming, he was empathetic, and he was taking notes. Think about the damage. While the CIA was spending millions of dollars and risking the lives of its bravest men to build a global wall against communism, Philby was handing Moscow the blueprint to the entire structure.
He was sitting in the very room where the special relationship was being built, and he was termites in the wood. But the lunches in Washington weren't just about sharing secrets. They were about deciding who would live and who would die. Moscow had a specific target in mind, a place where they wanted to send a message to the West that would never be forgotten. It was a small, mountainous country called Albania, and Angleton was about to tell his best friend exactly how the CIA planned to liberate it. The year is 1949. The Iron Curtain has fallen across Europe, but the West believes it has found a weak link: Albania. A plan is hatched in the deepest corridors of the CIA and MI6, codenamed Operation Valuable. It is the first major attempt by the West to actually roll back communism using armed force. The plan is classic spy movie material. Train groups of brave Albanian exiles, fly them into the dark of night, and have them parachute into their homeland to spark a democratic revolution. These men were patriots, fathers and brothers, willing to risk everything for freedom. But they never stood a chance. Every time a team of commandos landed in the mountains or hit a moonlit beach, the Albanian secret police were already there, weapons aimed and waiting. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Dozens, then hundreds of men were ambushed, captured, and executed. The West was baffled. How did the Soviets know exactly where and when the drops were happening? Back in Washington, James Jesus Angleton and his CIA colleagues were devastated. They looked for technical leaks, they checked their radio security, they questioned the low-level exiles. They looked everywhere, except at the man sitting in the liaison office. Kim Philby was the British representative on the Joint Committee for Albania. He knew every drop zone, he knew every radio frequency, he knew every name. And every evening, after a friendly drink with his American counterparts, he would send a coded report to Moscow. To Philby, these men weren't heroes. They were just data points on a map, expendable assets in a grand ideological game. Years later,
Philby would be asked if he felt any remorse for the hundreds of men he sent to their deaths. He simply shrugged. "To us," he said, "the victory of our cause was everything. Individual lives were secondary." This was the true face of Kim Philby. The charming British gentleman was, in reality, a mass murderer in a tailored suit. But while the bodies were piling up in Albania, the net in Washington was finally beginning to close. The FBI had picked up a scent, and for the first time, the spy of the century felt the cold breath of suspicion on his neck. May 1951. The world of Western intelligence is about to be set on fire. In the middle of the night, two high-ranking British diplomats, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, vanish from London. They cross the English Channel, race through France, and disappear behind the Iron Curtain. In Washington, the news hits like a sledgehammer. James Jesus Angleton is stunned. Burgess had been living in Philby's own house in D.C. Maclean had been a key contact for American atomic secrets. The Americans realize there is a massive leak at the very top of the British embassy. But then, the most terrifying question of all is asked. Who warned them? Who was the third man who told Burgess and Maclean that the FBI was closing in? All eyes turn to Kim Philby. Angleton, the man who shared his bed, his board, and his deepest secrets with Philby, feels a cold realization dawning on him. He had been played. The special relationship wasn't just broken. It was humiliated. The CIA demands that Philby be fired and investigated. Philby is recalled to London. He is stripped of his position. For weeks, he is interrogated in a windowless room by MI5's top investigators. They hit him with every piece of evidence they have. They talk about his past, his friends, and the suspicious accidents like the Volkov affair. Most men would break. Most men would sweat or stutter. But Philby was a man who had been living a lie for 20 years. He treated the interrogation like a game of chess. He was calm. He was polite. He used his slight stutter to buy time before answering. He looked his former friends in the eye and lied with the conviction of a saint. He didn't just survive the investigation. He conquered it. In 1955, the scandal reached the floor of the British Parliament. Under immense pressure, the Foreign Secretary, Harold Macmillan, stood up and officially cleared Philby of all charges. There was no evidence, Macmillan said, that Mr.
Philby had ever betrayed his country. Philby then did something truly audacious. He held a televised press conference in his mother's flat. He sat there, stone-faced and elegant, and told the world, "I have never been a communist. I have never worked for the Soviet Union." It was the greatest gaslighting in history. The British establishment, desperate to avoid further embarrassment, took him back. They even sent him to Beirut to work as a journalist, while secretly moonlighting for MI6 again. But the truth has a way of catching up, even in the desert. In a few years, a ghost from Philby's past would arrive in Beirut with a final offer, and a final confrontation that would end the double life forever. January 1963, Beirut, Lebanon. The Paris of the Middle East, a city of jazz clubs, gold souks, and spies from every nation. Kim Philby is here, living a quiet life as a journalist. He spends his days at the bar of the Normandy Hotel, nursing a drink and holding court with his usual charm. The world seems to have forgotten he was ever a suspect. But one evening, a ghost walks into the bar. His name is Nicholas Elliott. He is an MI6 officer and, more importantly, he is Philby's oldest and dearest friend. For decades, Elliott had been Philby's fiercest defender. He had fought the Americans to clear Kim's name.
He had staked his own reputation on Philby's loyalty. But now, Elliot is carrying a briefcase full of new evidence. A defector has finally provided the smoking gun. The mask is gone. The game of 30 years is over. They meet in a safe house overlooking the Mediterranean. The air is cold and rainy. Elliot looks his friend in the eye and tells him the truth. "I once looked up to you, Kim. Now, I only feel contempt." He offers Philby a deal, a full confession in exchange for immunity and a quiet retirement in the English countryside. Philby stammers. He gives a partial confession, admitting to some work for the Soviets in the 1930s. He asks for time to think it over. Elliot, perhaps out of a lingering, tragic sense of friendship, or perhaps under secret orders to let him go to avoid a trial, leaves Philby alone for a few days. It is the final mistake. On the night of January 23, 1963, a heavy thunderstorm rolls over Beirut. Philby tells his wife, Eleanor, that he is going to a dinner party. He steps out into the rain with nothing but an umbrella. He doesn't go to dinner. He heads for the docks. In the dark of the harbor, a Soviet freighter named the Dolmatova is waiting, its engines humming. Philby slips past the Lebanese port guards and climbs the gangplank. By the time the British realize he is gone, the ship is already in international waters, cutting through the black waves toward the Black Sea. Kim Philby has finally reached his promised land.
He is heading for Moscow, the city he has served in the shadows since he was 22 years old. He expects a hero's welcome. He expects to be a general in the KGB. He expects to finally be home. But as the lights of Beirut fade into the distance, Philby is about to discover that the Soviet Union of his dreams does not exist. And the life waiting for him behind the Iron Curtain will be his final, most painful prison. Kim Philby arrived in Moscow expecting a hero's welcome. He imagined himself walking into the KGB headquarters to the sound of applause, ready to take his place as a high-ranking general in the revolution he had served for 30 years. The reality was a freezing slap in the face. The Soviets didn't trust him. To the KGB, a man who could betray his own country so perfectly was a man who could never truly be trusted. Instead of a command, they gave him a golden cage, a comfortable apartment, a state pension, and a life of total isolation. For the first 10 years, they didn't even let him visit their headquarters. He was a trophy to be displayed, not a soldier to be used. Philby, the man who had dined with the elite of Washington and London, now spent his days standing in grey lines for basic groceries. He saw the workers' paradise he had killed for, and he found a world of corruption, breadlines, and fear. He began to drink. Not the social martinis of his youth, but a desperate, lonely alcoholism that saw him consume bottles of vodka just to numb the silence of his apartment. In the West, Philby's ghost was doing more damage than the man ever could. His betrayal shattered the CIA. His best friend, James Jesus Angleton, descended into a madness of paranoia. Angleton spent the rest of his career destroying the lives of innocent CIA officers, convinced that if his best friend, Kim, was a mole, then anyone could be. This mole hunt paralyzed American intelligence for a decade, exactly as Moscow had hoped. Philby eventually found a small piece of peace when he married his fourth wife, Rufina, a Russian woman who cared for him in his final years. But the sparkle in his eyes was gone. He had traded everything, his friends, his family, his country, for an ideology that had failed. In 1988, Kim Philby died in Moscow at the age of 76. He was buried with full military honors, a hero of the Soviet Union. But as his coffin was lowered into the Russian soil, he was a man who belonged nowhere.
Kim Philby's story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one holding a gun, but the one holding your hand. He proved that trust is the most fragile currency in the world, and once it's stolen, it can never truly be replaced. If you found this dive into the shadows of the Cold War fascinating, don't let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation into the secrets that shaped our world.
Share this with a fellow history buff and tell us in the comments, do you think Philby was a man of principle or just the greatest con artist of the 20th century? We'll see you in the next episode.